There is a strange and bitter truth whispered through history in a society that thrives on noise. Those who see clearly are cursed to live in exile, even when surrounded by people. It is not the physical exile of being sent away, but a deeper one, the exile of the mind. You begin to notice patterns others cannot or will not see. You see the madness hiding in the ordinary, the contradictions people defend as sacred, the lies everyone repeats until they sound like truth. And with that awareness comes a quiet pain, the realization that the clearer your vision, the lonelier your path becomes. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this with almost frightening clarity. He warned that the rare individual who awakens to deeper truths will feel alienated, not because the world rejects wisdom outright, but because it secretly fears it. Wisdom threatens comfort, it strips away illusions, and most people, Nietzsche believed, would rather cling to comfortable lies than endure the discomfort of truth. This is the paradox of the wise in a foolish society. Your insight is both a light and a wound. A light, because it allows you to see through deception. A wound, because once you've seen, you can never unsee, and those around you may see you as strange, arrogant, or even dangerous. But this tension is not unique to Nietzsche. Philosophers across the ages, from Socrates, who was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth with inconvenient questions, to Kierkegaard, who warned that the crowd is untruth, have wrestled with the cost of seeing too deeply in a world built on shallow consensus. In this video, we will explore 6 core insights, part philosophical, part psychological, that reveal why wisdom so often feels like a curse, and how to bear it without bitterness. These are not abstract musings, but living ideas you can use to navigate a culture that may misunderstand, mock, or ignore your clarity. Because perhaps the real task is not to escape a foolish society, but to learn how to remain uncorrupted by it, while keeping your vision intact. Their quote is a moment in every thinking person's life when the world changes. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. In fact, it's usually quiet. You might be sitting in a classroom in a cafe or staring out a train window when it happens. Some small thing clicks, a question, a contradiction, a truth so obvious it's almost absurd, and suddenly you see through the surface of things. It's as if a veil you didn't know existed has been torn away. And in that moment, you realize most people are still living beneath that veil. Nietzsche called this awakening the path of the free spirit. And thus spoke Zarathustra. He paints a picture of the Übermensch, the overman, not as a tyrant, but as one who has outgrown the old illusions. He no longer needs to borrow morality from the crowd, nor meaning from religion, nor validation from popularity. He builds his own values, his own compass. But Nietzsche knew this path was not romantic in the way people imagine. It is not the heroic march of a genius welcomed by grateful minds. It is the solitary climb of someone who must learn to breathe thin air while those below gossip about how strange, even dangerous, he has become. The burden of seeing too clearly is this: you can no longer pretend not to know. Once you've noticed the cracks in the social facade, every conversation at a dinner party becomes a test of patience. Every headline feels like theater. Every confident opinion reveals the fragile scaffolding of unexamined beliefs. And here's the paradox: people sense, even without words, that you see differently, and they often respond not with curiosity, but with suspicion. It is not your wisdom they reject, it is the discomfort it stirs in them. Nietzsche believed that most people live within what he called herd morality, a morality built for safety, not truth. Within this herd, the greatest virtue is conformity, and the greatest vice is to make others uncomfortable with inconvenient insights. The wise, by their very nature, are guilty of that vice. Imagine walking through a carnival with glasses that reveal the machinery behind the rides, the rusting bolts, the tired operators, the staged smiles of performers. You try to point it out to someone, and they snap at you. Why are you ruining the fun? That's what it feels like to awaken in a culture content with illusions. Psychologically, this creates what existentialists later called double consciousness. You live in the same world as everyone else, but you also see through it. And living in two worlds at once is exhausting. This is why Nietzsche describes solitude not as a luxury for the wise, but as a necessity. You must learn to be alone, not because you despise others, but because their refusal to see can drain you if you let it. But solitude comes with its own dangers. The more time you spend away from the crowd, the harder it becomes to relate to it. And here lies the first great challenge of wisdom. How do you live among people whose illusions you cannot share without becoming bitter, arrogant, or unbearably lonely? Nietzsche's answer was brutal and liberating. Stop expecting the herd to understand you. Your task is not to convince them, nor to win their approval. Your task is to become so grounded in your own clarity that misunderstanding no longer wounds you. Because here steps the truth few want to admit. The wise are not exiled because the world hates wisdom. They are exiled because the world hates what wisdom demands of it: change, growth, discomfort. And so the burden of seeing too clearly becomes paradoxically your freedom. You are no longer bound by the same illusions. The question now is whether you can carry that freedom without letting it turn into contempt. There sips an old Danish saying, "He who points out the wind is blamed for its blowing." In other words, the one who notices the truth is often treated as the cause of the discomfort it brings. Søren Kierkegaard understood this deeply. In his journals, he wrote, "The crowd is untruth, not because every individual in the crowd is dishonest, but because when people merge into a collective, they adopt a strange new morality, one that prioritizes comfort over reality and belonging over truth." Think of it like this: the crowd runs on myths, not just ancient myths about gods and heroes, but modern ones. The story that our leaders always act in our best interest, that our social systems are fair, that progress is inevitable, that most people are good at heart. These myths are not necessarily false in every case, but they are often oversimplified, polished, and repeated until they form a warm, safe blanket over the messiness of reality. Now, here's where the wise person becomes dangerous. When you speak the truth, you are not just delivering facts, you are tearing holes in that blanket, and nobody thanks you for making them cold. Kierkegaard warned that the crowd will defend its myths with the same ferocity an animal defends its territory. They will ridicule, ostracize, or even punish the one who disturbs their comforting illusions. History gives us countless examples. Socrates was forced to drink poison for asking questions Athens didn't want to answer. Galileo was placed under house arrest for showing that the earth was not the center of the universe. In both cases, the facts were not the real crime. It was the challenge to the collective story that could not be tolerated. And here's the cruel twist: the more obvious the truth is, the more vicious the resistance becomes. Because a fragile myth can survive only if everyone agrees to pretend it's unbreakable. Psychologically, this is tied to what modern researchers call cognitive dissonance. When people are confronted with evidence that threatens their worldview, the discomfort is so intense that they often reject the evidence, not to preserve truth, but to preserve themselves from emotional collapse. The wise, by refusing to join the collective pretense, become a threat to the emotional equilibrium of the group. Nietzsche saw this as well, though in different words. He believed that human beings cling to life preserving errors, illusions that make existence bearable, and to strip these away without offering a stronger replacement is to invite hostility, even hatred. So the wise face a dilemma. Do you speak the truth, you see, knowing the crowd will defend its myths? Or do you remain silent, becoming a ghost in the marketplace, nodding politely while inside you scream? Kierkegaard offered a path that sounds simple, but is difficult to live. Speak the truth, but first, withdraw from the crowd's need for approval. If your self worth depends on being liked, the crowd will always control you. If you can bear being misunderstood, you are free to speak without fear. And here's the subtle irony: those who attack you for challenging their myths may one day quote you, celebrate you, or even build statues in your honor when it's safe for them to do so. But by then, you will have learned that the approval of the crowd was never the point. So if the first burden of wisdom is seeing too clearly, the second is accepting that the crowd will protect its myths as if its life depended on them. And in a way, it does. If you've ever been in a conversation where you say something you know is true, only to be met with blank stares, polite nods, or outright hostility, you've tasted one of the oldest poisons in history: the curse of being right too soon. Socrates knew this poison well. He walked the streets of Athens, asking questions no one wanted to answer, questions that revealed contradictions in politics, religion, and personal virtue. The Athenians tolerated him for a while, but as his influence grew, so did the unease. In the end, they condemned him for corrupting the youth and impiety, his real crime, planting seeds the city was not ready to let grow. Centuries later, Galileo would suffer a similar fate. In 1633, he stood before the Roman Inquisition, accused of heresy for supporting the Copernican view that the earth revolved around the sun. This was not simply a scientific debate. It was a direct assault on the theological worldview that gave the church its authority. Galileo's evidence was strong, but the world was not ready. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a prisoner for telling the truth a few hundred years too early. History is littered with such stories: prophets, reformers, inventors, and thinkers whose ideas would eventually be celebrated, but only after their lifetimes had ended. Why? Because truth is not accepted simply because it is true. It must arrive at a moment when society can bear it. Psychologically, this is because ideas have a gestation period. The human mind, both individually and collectively, resists rapid change. New truths require the slow erosion of old certainties. Present them too early, and the collective immune system activates ridicule, suppression, punishment. Nietzsche understood this intimately. In The Gay Science, he famously wrote, "This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." He was speaking of the death of God, the collapse of the old metaphysical order, and warning that humanity would take centuries to absorb its implications. He knew the truth could not simply be proclaimed, it had to be survived. Here lies the danger for the wise. Clarity does not always equal timing. Seeing the mountain peak does not mean the world is ready to climb it with you. And the more passionately you push your vision, the greater the resistance you may provoke. So, what is the answer? Should the wise person keep silent until the world is ready? Socrates would say no. Speak the truth, even if it costs you, Kierkegaard might agree, adding that truth telling is a matter of personal integrity, not public readiness. But a more strategic approach comes from Machiavelli. If you must introduce a disruptive truth, do so in steps. Give the world a bridge between its current illusions and the new reality, or it will burn you before crossing it. For the modern seeker, this means accepting a paradox. You may not live to see the value of your insight recognized. The applause may come decades or centuries after your voice has fallen silent. If your motivation is recognition, you will wither. With your motivation is the preservation and transmission of truth itself, you can endure. This is the third curse of wisdom, the possibility that your vision is not for your time, but for a future you will never inhabit. The question becomes, are you willing to serve a truth you may never see fully bloom? Not all enemies of wisdom come with swords drawn or laws ready to condemn you. Often, the greatest obstacle is quieter, subtler, and far more persistent. It is the slow, grinding force of mediocrity. Mediocrity is not merely a lack of talent or intelligence, it is a mindset, a deep attachment to what is familiar, easy, and safe. It does not hate wisdom because wisdom is wrong. It resents wisdom because wisdom makes it feel small. Jose Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, warned of this in The Revolt of the Masses. He described how the mediocre man does not recognize his mediocrity. He believes his views are the standard for all. When the exceptional appears, the mediocre does not respond with curiosity, but with a defensive flattening. If I cannot rise to your level, I will pull you down to mine. Nietzsche echoed this in his warnings about the last man, a creature of comfort, stripped of ambition, who celebrates safety above all else. The last man says, we have invented happiness, while quietly ensuring that nothing and no one disrupts the fragile calm. In such a climate, wisdom is not met with open debate, but with subtle resistance. A new idea is ignored rather than argued against. An uncomfortable truth is met with polite dismissal. An exceptional act is quietly undermined, not because it is evil, but because it reminds others of what they are not. Psychologists call this status leveling. In groups, members often unconsciously work to maintain a shared comfort zone. Those who rise above it, in skill, vision, or moral clarity, disrupt the balance, provoking envy or quiet sabotage. The group may not openly attack, but it will ensure that the exceptional does not stand too far apart. The danger here is twofold for the wise. First, mediocrity surrounds you constantly. It is woven into institutions, workplaces, even families. Second, it works slowly, unlike persecution, which is sharp and dramatic. Mediocrity erodes your edge over time. You are encouraged to compromise, to tone it down, to stop asking uncomfortable questions, not out of malice, but under the guise of being reasonable. Nietzsche saw this as one of the greatest threats to human potential. The herd does not need to destroy the higher type outright. It only needs to keep him busy with trivialities until his fire dies out. The result? A society that avoids catastrophe, but also avoids greatness. For the modern seeker, this can feel like death by 1,000 small concessions. You stop reading the challenging book because no one else finds it interesting. You water down your convictions in order to get along. You let your deepest insights stay unspoken because you're tired of explaining yourself. One day you look in the mirror and realize you have become exactly what you once refused to be, comfortably mediocre. The way out is not to despise the average person that only feeds the ego and isolates you further, but to guard your inner life fiercely. You must build what Ortega y Gasset called a noble life project, a commitment so personal and vital that it cannot be dissolved by the inertia of the crowd. And here's the truth: the wise will often have to live with mediocrity without letting it swallow them. That means learning to navigate institutions and communities without becoming deluded by them, keeping your vision alive, even in environments that neither see it nor want it. This is the fourth curse of wisdom. You may not be destroyed by your enemies, but by the slow embrace of the ordinary. And the question becomes, can you walk among the comfortable without becoming one of them? Up to this point, we've spoken about the dangers that come from the world, the crowd's myths, the timing of truth, the slow erosion of mediocrity. But there is another danger, far more intimate and insidious, the threat that comes from within. Carl Jung understood this danger better than most. He warned that when a person becomes conscious of the ignorance and folly of others, the natural shadow that emerges is contempt. And contempt, if left unchecked, can rot the very wisdom you've worked so hard to cultivate. It begins innocently enough. You see through the lies, the posturing, the shallow entertainments that hypnotize the masses. You feel frustration, a perfectly human response. But frustration, repeated often enough, hardens into judgment. And judgment, left to ferment, becomes bitterness. Jungsit's theory of the shadow is crucial here. He argued that every person carries within them unacknowledged impulses, traits they deny or repress. For the wise person, the shadow often contains the very arrogance and self importance they despise in others. The irony is sharp. You can become so focused on the foolishness of the world that you stop seeing your own. Nietzsche, too, saw this danger. His idea of the free spirit was not just someone who escapes the herd's morality, but someone who escapes the need to feel superior to it. For him, the highest type of person was not the one who condemns the mediocre, but the one who simply outgrows the need for their approval or their downfall. Psychologically, contempt acts like a toxin. It isolates you from others, but it also isolates you from growth. Once you believe you are above the crowd, you stop listening. And when you stop listening, you stop learning. The result? You may be right about many things, but you become insufferable and eventually wrong about the things that matter most. So the wise face a double bind. If you open yourself too much to the foolishness of the world, it can exhaust you. If you close yourself off in contempt, it can corrupt you. Jung's solution was integration. This means confronting your shadow honestly, admitting when your frustration is driven not just by moral clarity, but by your own impatience, wounded pride, or desire to control. By owning these parts of yourself, you prevent them from seizing the driver's seat. Practically, this might mean catching yourself when mockery becomes your default reaction, remembering that ignorance is not always willful, sometimes it's circumstantial, recognizing that you too have blind spots, even if they are different from the crowd's. This is not about excusing harmful ignorance. It's about refusing to let your own wisdom harden into a form of spiritual vanity. There's a line in the Tao Te Ching that says, "He who stands on tiptoe is not steady." The wise who constantly look down on others eventually lose their own grounding. In the end, the inner war of the wise is not about winning against the world's ignorance. It's about winning against the parts of yourself that would rather sneer than serve, that would rather be right than be whole. This is the fifth curse of wisdom, that you can lose yourself not by being wrong, but by being too convinced of your rightness. And so the question becomes, can you see the foolishness of the world without letting it make a fool of you? If the path of wisdom is so fraught with loneliness, resistance, mediocrity, and even the risk of our own corruption, then the natural question is, how do you survive it? Or better yet, how do you live it well? For this, we turn to the Stoics, thinkers like Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, who faced their own versions of a foolish, corrupt, and often hostile society. They knew that wisdom could not always change the world, but it could change the person carrying it. The Stoics began with a simple but ruthless principle: you cannot control the world, only your response to it. Epictetus, born a slave, learned early that he could not dictate the cruelty or ignorance of others, but he could decide whether to let their behavior poison his mind. His answer was not withdrawal, but mastery of his own inner life. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, wrote in his Meditations that we must waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. For him, philosophy was not about winning debates or proving one's superiority. It was about becoming unshakable in character, so that the world's foolishness could not turn you bitter or small. This doesn't mean retreating into passivity. The Stoics were active participants in life, but they acted from a place of inner sovereignty. Their calm was not ignorance of the world's problems, but a refusal to be broken by them. Practically, this means a few things for the modern seeker: detach from the need for recognition. If your worth depends on the crowd's approval, you are their prisoner. Speak truth, but let go of the expectation that it will be welcomed. Guard your inner space. Decide what ideas, influences, and company you allow to shape you. In an age of constant noise, protecting your attention is protecting your soul. Act in alignment with your values, quietly if necessary. Some revolutions are loud, others are invisible to the masses. Both matter. Practice the discipline of perspective. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Many of our frustrations with society are amplified in our own minds. Learning to see them in proportion prevents burnout. Accept the limits of your influence." Marcus Aurelius ruled over millions and still knew he could not fix every injustice. You cannot save the world from its own unpreparedness, but you can refuse to join in its corruption. In this way, the curse of wisdom can transform into a kind of quiet rebellion. You stop fighting every battle the crowd throws at you and start choosing the ones that matter. You stop exhausting yourself trying to awaken everyone and focus on staying awake yourself. Nietzsche might object here, warning that stoicism can sometimes become resignation, a way of making peace with mediocrity instead of overcoming it. But I think there's a deeper compatibility Stoic strength can be the foundation upon which the Nietzschean spirit builds new values. Without that inner fortitude, the burden of seeing clearly will crush you. In the end, bearing the curse without breaking is about this: living in such a way that your clarity remains intact, your compassion remains alive, and your spirit remains untamed, even in the midst of a society that neither understands nor wants what you carry. And that brings us to our final step, the conclusion, where we still gather these six insights, revisit the question we began with, and see what it truly means to live wisely in a foolish world. We began with a paradox. To see clearly in a foolish world is both a gift and a wound. It frees you from illusions, but it also sets you apart. And the more deeply you understand, the more deeply you may feel the loneliness of that understanding. Across this journey, we've explored six insights that illuminate why wisdom so often feels like a curse and how it might yet be born without breaking. The burden of seeing too clearly. Nietzsche's free spirit sees through illusions that others cling to, and so must learn to live without the comfort of shared delusions. The crowd will always protect its myths. Kierkegaard's warning that the collective will defend its illusions, even at the expense of truth. The danger of being too early. From Socrates to Galileo, the price of bringing truth before the world is ready to hear it. The Psychology of Mediocrity. Ortega y Gasset and Nietzsche's insight that the average often resists the exceptional, not from reason, but from wounded pride. The Inner War of the Wise. Jung's reminder that contempt is the shadow of wisdom, and that without humility, insight can curdle into arrogance. How to bear the curse without breaking. The Stoic art of guarding your inner life, acting with integrity, and refusing to be broken by what you cannot control. These are not abstract principles. They are survival skills for the thinking soul in an unthinking age. They remind us that wisdom is not simply knowing what is true, it is knowing how to live with that truth in a world that may not want it. So, what does this mean for you? It means accepting that misunderstanding is not proof you are wrong. It means learning to speak truth without needing applause. It means refusing to let frustration turn into bitterness or clarity into cruelty. It means holding yourself to the same standard you wish the world would rise to. Nietzsche was right. Wisdom will set you apart. But he was also clear about something we too easily forget, that the task is not to be understood by the crowd, but to become who you are, fully and without apology. Socrates drank the hemlock, not because he enjoyed martyrdom, but because he would not betray the truth for comfort. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth, yet wrote in his journal each night as though speaking to no one but himself. Both knew that wisdom is not measured by how many listen, but by how faithfully you live it. And so, the challenge I leave you with is simple, but not easy. Live in such a way that your clarity does not fade, your integrity does not bend, and your compassion does not die, even when surrounded by noise, mediocrity, or hostility. Do not let the foolishness of the age make you foolish in return, because perhaps the real curse is not that wisdom is lonely. Perhaps the real curse is that so few are willing to pay its price. If you are, then you do not merely survive in a foolish society, you become the quiet proof that another way of living is possible. If this conversation has resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe, not as a transaction, but as a continuation of a shared journey. Here we will keep asking the questions the crowd prefers to ignore, and keep each other awake in a world that prefers to dream.